What is more terrifying than receiving the worst phone call of your life from your son in the middle of a quiet countryside afternoon? It is being the mother who hears it, the one who has been smiling all afternoon over a plate of fresh fruit, planning a new roof and waiting for the next family visit, completely unaware that the bright, peaceful world she has built her entire life around has already shattered somewhere far away on the other end of the line. In today's emotional story, Mother Ly is enjoying a quiet evening with kind Uncle Dung at her small countryside house when the call from Jack arrives, carrying news that nearly takes her life on the spot. As the crisis spreads from the city hospital all the way back to the village porch, Jack is forced to set aside his grief and become a man cold enough to lay a trap for the two thieves who tried to destroy his family. What begins as a small basket of guavas in a peaceful courtyard soon becomes the night two men learn, the hard way, that the husband and son they thought they could fool was always one step ahead. The late afternoon sky above the village was a soft, warm gold as Mother Ly sat in the courtyard of her small countryside house, slicing fresh guavas from her garden onto a chipped ceramic plate. The air smelled of grass and dust and the faint sweetness of ripe fruit. The wooden table in front of her was covered with a clean cotton cloth she had spread out earlier that afternoon. On the plate beside the guavas sat a small pile of longans she had picked just that morning, their thin brown shells still slightly warm from the day's sun. The breeze moved softly through the old mango tree at the corner of the yard. Somewhere down the lane, the neighbors' children were calling each other home for dinner. Across the wooden table from her sat Uncle Dung, the kind older neighbor who had been a quiet, steady friend to her family for as long as she could remember. He was sitting comfortably in his old rattan chair with a small cup of tea in his hand, laughing softly at something she had just said. She was talking about Jack and Tu Tien. "Back, Dung," she said warmly, slicing another piece of guava and placing it gently on the plate. "My Jack and Tu Tien called me yesterday. They told me in a few more days they are coming home to fix the front porch roof for me. They said the wood beam over the gate has been leaning since the last storm and they want to replace the whole thing before the rains come." Uncle Dung chuckled gently and nodded. "That son of yours is something else, Ba Ly. There are not many young people anymore who think about their mother's roof before their own house." She smiled the small, soft smile of a mother who has been thinking about that exact thing all afternoon. "They just had a good season with the lotus pond. Back, Dung. They worked so hard for it, the two of them. I told them, save the money for yourselves, for the baby, for the future. But they would not listen to me. They said the roof first." She set down the small knife. She picked up a longan, peeled it carefully, and handed it across the table to him. "Ba Ly has a great blessing in this life," Uncle Dung said softly, taking the longan with both hands. "A good daughter-in-law, a good son. Not everyone in the village has what you have." She did not answer for a moment. She simply smiled and looked down at her own hands. Her hair was pulled back neatly into the small, soft bun she always wore. Her green blouse with the little flower brooch caught the warm afternoon light. She looked, for that quiet moment, like the happiest woman in the entire village. The peace lasted exactly 30 more seconds. Her phone buzzed softly on the wooden table beside the plate of fruit. She glanced down. Her face brightened the way only a mother's face brightens when her son's name appears on the small lit screen. "Oh," she said warmly, "it is Jack." She picked it up. She pressed the green button. She pressed the small speaker icon because she liked Uncle Dung to hear her son's voice too. "Allo, Jack, Con. Have you eaten yet? Met was just talking about you and Tu Tien to back Dung." Met. The single syllable came out wrong. It came out broken. It came out from somewhere very far away with a terribly echo of an ambulance siren somewhere behind it and the sound of his own breathing trying not to be heard. The smile on Mother Ly's face slowed. "Jack, Met, please listen to me. Met, please stay calm. Jack, what is wrong? Met. Our house was robbed last night." two men came in. They took the money. The money is not important. Jack, what about Met? Tu Tien is in the hospital. They pushed her against the stone edge of the lotus pond. She is in the provincial hospital. She is in critical care. The doctors say it is very hard to save the baby. Mother Loy's smile, the one that had been on her face for the entire afternoon, the one she had worn since slicing the first guava, froze completely. It did not fall. It did not disappear. It simply turned to stone on her face like something forgotten. The plate of guavas slipped out of her left hand. It struck the dirt courtyard floor with a soft, heavy sound. The slices of fruit scattered across the ground. Across the table, Uncle Dung stood up so fast his rattan chair tipped back behind him. Tu Tien, Mother Loy whispered. Her voice came out very small. My child, my grandchild, Me, please. Please breathe. Me, I am here. I am at the hospital. I am with her. Please breathe, Met. Please. Her eyes rolled back slowly. Her body began to tilt sideways out of the wooden chair. Uncle Dung was already moving. He caught her under both shoulders before she could fall and lowered her gently onto the dirt of the courtyard. The phone clattered out of her hand and landed on the table. Jack's voice was still coming out of the small speaker, calling her name over and over. Ba Loy, Uncle Dung said sharply. Ba Loy, open your eyes. Ba Loy. He grabbed the phone with one hand. Jack, he shouted into it. Jack, your mother has fainted. She is unconscious. Her blood pressure has spiked. Jack. From the other end of the line, Jack's voice came out in a way Uncle Dung had never heard from him before. Half scream, half prayer. Met, please. Back Dung, please. Save Met for me, please. I cannot leave Tu Tien. Please back. I have her, Jack. I have her. I am taking her to the village hospital right now. Stay with Tu Tien. Stay with her, son. I will call you back. Uncle Dung threw the phone in his pocket. Has scooped Mother Loy gently into his arms. She was light. She was much lighter than she should have been. Had carried her at a fast, steady pace out of the courtyard toward his motorbike at the gate. The neighbor across the lane heard the commotion and came running. Within minutes, Uncle Dung was on the back of a borrowed pickup truck with Mother Loy laid across his lap and a neighbor at the wheel, racing toward the small village hospital 10 kilometers down the road. Behind them in the empty courtyard, the slices of guava lay scattered across the dirt. The plate of longan sat untouched on the wooden table. The afternoon sunlight stretched on across the small house exactly as it had a minute before, as if nothing had happened. As if the whole world had not just changed in the span of a single phone call. In the corridor of the provincial hospital, Jack lowered the phone slowly from his ear. For a long moment he did not move. He stood in front of the door of Tu Tien's room with the phone in his hand. The corridor was bright and white and empty. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above his head. From inside the closed door, he could hear the small, steady rhythm of the heart monitor that was keeping his world from completely ending. He took one step away from the door, then another. Then he sat down slowly on the floor of the corridor with his back against the wall. He drew his knees up, he put his head in his hands, and he stayed there. Uncle Phuong, who had been sitting on the wooden bench a few meters down the corridor, stood up slowly and walked over to him. He did not speak. He sat down on the floor beside Jack, with the careful slowness of an old man who knew that some moments do not need words, only company. He put one hand on Jack's shoulder. Met Loy? Jack whispered. I heard. Jack. She fainted back. I heard. Back Dung has her. She will be all right. Back Dung will not let anything happen to her. It is too much, Back. It is too much. Uncle Phuong did not answer for a moment. The old man looked down the empty corridor toward the closed door of Tu Tien's room. He looked up at the ceiling. He looked at the young man sitting beside him on the floor of the hospital. He looked at his own hands. Jack. Yes. Back. Look at me, Khan. Jack lifted his head slowly. His face was wet. His eyes were red. His shoulders were shaking very slightly. Your shoulder is the only one this family has left to lean on right now, Uncle Phuong said gently. Tu Tien needs you. The baby needs you. Met Loy needs you. Bac Dung needs you. I need you. You cannot break, Jack. Not now, later. Later, you can break for as long as you need, but not now. Jack did not answer. He looked down at his hands. He wiped his face with the back of his sleeve. When he raised his head again, something behind his eyes had changed. The grief was still there. The exhaustion was still there. But under both of them, something cold and steady had begun to form. The eyes of the young man who had spent 10 years sitting at boardroom tables in the city, making fast, accurate decisions under pressure. The eyes that had built a company from nothing. The eyes that, until this morning, his enemies had never had the privilege of meeting. They pushed me into a corner back, he said quietly. They took my money. They tried to kill my wife and my child. They almost killed my mother. They thought I was a country boy with a lotus pond. He stood up slowly from the floor. I am going to make them pay for it back. Every single one of them. Uncle Phuong stood up beside him. He looked at the younger man for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slowly. Tell me what you need, Jack. I need a phone call to Bac Dung. I need him to come up to the city as soon as Met is stable. And I need you to walk with me back to the small tea stall across the road from the hospital. There is something I need someone to overhear. A short while later, Jack and Uncle Phuong sat together at a small plastic table at the tea stall across the road from the hospital entrance. The stall was a simple place with 3 plastic tables and a kettle and a small woman who sold sweet iced tea for 10,000 dong a glass. Jack had chosen the table on the corner closest to the road. He sat facing the hospital. Uncle Phuong sat across from him. Hung was standing 20 meters away on the opposite corner. He was pretending to look at his phone. He was pretending to wait for someone. He had been lingering near the hospital entrance since early that morning, watching, listening, trying to learn whether anyone had begun to suspect him. Jack had spotted him within the first 10 minutes. Jack picked up his phone. He dialed Uncle Dung. Uncle Dung answered immediately. Jack, Bac Dung. How is Met? She is awake, Khan. She is stable. The doctors say it was the shock. She is asking for you. She is crying. Jack closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them. He did not lower his voice. He spoke into the phone in a perfectly clear, controlled tone that was just slightly too loud for the small tea stall, the kind of slightly raised voice that men use on phones in public when they are tired and stressed. Bac Dung, please look after Met for me. Tell her I will come home as soon as I can. Tell her not to worry about the money. The hospital bills for Met and Tu Tien, I can cover all of them. Jack, the 1 billion, back. Please listen to me carefully. The 1 billion that was stolen yesterday, that was not the real money. That was the prop cash I had prepared for our farm's media shoot next week, the influencer team I told you about. The real 1 billion, back. I still have it. I hid it in the secret compartment under the bed in our wooden bedroom at the Lotus Pond house. I had not gotten around to taking it to the bank yet. Tomorrow morning I will drive back to the farm and pick it up and bring it straight to the hospital to pay everything. Across the road, Hung's head had stopped moving. He was no longer pretending to look at his phone. He was standing perfectly still. Jack continued, calm and tired sounding, as if he were simply giving an exhausted update to a worried older man. Yes, back. The compartment under the bed. They never even came close to it last night. They only found the prop cash on the kitchen table. They got away with paper. The real money is still safe. Uncle Dung, on the other end of the line, was silent for one long second. Then he understood. His voice came back calm and steady. "All right, Jack. I understand. Drive carefully tomorrow, Con." "Yes, back. I will. Take care of Met for me. I will call you in the morning." Jack ended the call. He set the phone down on the small plastic table. He took a slow sip of the sweet iced tea. He did not look across the road at Hung. He did not need to. In his peripheral vision, 20 meters away, Hung had already turned and started walking quickly down the side street, his hand pulling out his own phone, his face lit up with the bright, sharp light of pure greed. Jack lowered his glass. He took the bait back. He said quietly to Uncle Phuong, "He did, Jack. Tonight, then, tonight." The night came down slowly across the lotus pond. The wooden farmhouse stood completely dark and silent under the pale moon. The cicadas had keyed. The lotus leaves floated still on the unmoving water. There were no lights inside the house. There was no sound from the kitchen. The 3 dogs, Vong, Mew, and Ki, had been moved earlier into the small wooden shed beside the back garden, and the door of the shed had been left just slightly open. Inside the dark living room, Jack stood quietly with his back against the wall beside the wardrobe. Beside him, in the deeper shadow of the doorway, Uncle Phuong stood very still. Behind Uncle Phuong, Uncle Dung, who had driven up from the village that very afternoon as soon as Mother Loy was stable, stood with his big hand resting calmly on the edge of the doorframe. And behind all 3 of them, in the hallway beyond the kitchen, 4 officers from the local commune police force waited in complete silence, their radios off. At 9 minutes past 11, the soft sound of the back door lock being scraped came faintly through the house. Jack did not breathe. Uncle Phuong did not breathe. Uncle Dung did not breathe. The back door opened with a faint creak. 2 figures stepped softly into the kitchen. One of them was tall, the other was thinner. With quick, nervous movements, they moved through the kitchen into the hallway and turned toward the bedroom. They moved quickly, with the confidence of men who had been promised an easy reward. They went straight to the bed. They knelt down. They pulled up the wooden floor panel under the bed. They reached into the small compartment. "Got it?" Hung whispered. His voice was bright with greed and triumph. "It's here. The box is here." The teller man laughed softly. At that exact moment, every light in the house came on at once. The 2 men froze. Hung's head jerked up. He stared at the doorway. Jack stepped out of the shadow first. Uncle Phuong stepped out behind him. Uncle Dung stepped out behind Uncle Phuong. The 4 officers stepped out from the hallway. And from the shed in the back garden, the door of which had been left slightly open, the 3 dogs came running into the house barking furiously, blocking the back door completely. Hung's face went the color of paper. The tailor man's hand fell from the small wooden box. Jack walked slowly across the bedroom. He stopped 2 steps from Hung. He looked down at his cousin kneeling on the floor with the empty wooden box in his hands. His voice came out perfectly calm and perfectly cold. "You sat at my mother's table, Hung. You called me En. You came to my farm yesterday afternoon, and you borrowed 200,000 dong with a sad face and a basket of guavas. Last night, you came back with a mask, and you pushed my pregnant wife into the stone edge of the lotus pond. This morning, you stood at the door of her hospital room with another basket of fruit and asked me what was stolen." Hung opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Jack did not raise his voice. "My wife is in critical care. My child is on a heart monitor. My mother almost died this afternoon because of you. Tonight, with my own hands, I am sending you to prison." He turned to the officers. "He is yours, En." The officers moved. The handcuffs clicked. Hung's hands began to shake. The taller man tried briefly to stand and was pressed back to the floor. The 3 dogs continued to bark at the back door, calm and steady, the way dogs bark when they know the danger is already finished and they are simply finishing their job. Jack did not watch the arrest. He walked out of the bedroom. He walked through the dark kitchen. He walked out onto the wooden veranda beside the lotus pond. Uncle Phuong followed him a moment later. So did Uncle Dung. The two older men stood on either side of Jack on the veranda and looked out across the still moonlit pond. The water lily Tu Tien had planted weeks ago had finally bloomed, a small pale flower glowing softly under the moon. Jack pulled out his phone. He dialed the hospital. A nurse answered. This is Jack. Is my wife awake? She woke up half an hour ago, She has been asking for you. The baby's heart rhythm is stable. The doctor says the worst has passed. Jack closed his eyes. He stood very still for a long moment. Behind him, in the bright kitchen, the officers were leading Hung and the tallier man out of the house in handcuffs. In front of him, the small white water lily floated peacefully on the still surface of the pond. "Tell her I'm coming home, he said softly into the phone. "Tell her it's over. Tell her I'm coming home." He ended the call. The cold, steady fire inside his chest, the one that had been burning since the moment he had seen Hung's face under the moon 2 nights ago, finally began to settle. Some men do not get justice. Some men receive justice slowly, through courts and lawyers and years of waiting. And some men, when they are pushed into a corner with everything they love on the line, become quiet and patient and exact, and build the trap themselves brick by brick, and walk their enemies into it with their own hands. Jack stood on the wooden veranda between Uncle Phuong and Uncle Dung. He looked at the pale water lily on the pond. He thought of Tu Tien lying awake in the white hospital bed, asking the nurses where he was. He thought of Mother Loy sitting up in another hospital bed in the village, crying. He thought of the baby's small, steady heart rhythm on the monitor. He thought of all of them, and for the first time in 2 days, he allowed himself to breathe out. The countryside moonlight stretched softly across the lotus pond. The cicadas in the trees beside the garden began, very faintly, to sing again. And the 3 dogs, Vong, Mew, and Ki, came quietly out of the kitchen and sat down on the wooden veranda at his feet, the way they always sat, the way they had been waiting to sit, the way they had been quietly defending this house from the very first night. Jack and Tu Tien had moved in. Tomorrow he would drive back to the city. Tomorrow he would walk into Tu Tien's room and hold her hand. Tomorrow he would call his mother and finally tell her the truth. But tonight, on the veranda of the wooden farmhouse beside the lotus pond, beneath the pale countryside moon, the man who had spent 2 days holding everything inside finally allowed one slow tear to fall. And then he turned and he walked back inside his home.